Hey, all you ethic cuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday. If you think we can change our world by making our organizations better, we got a real treat for you today. We got Lucinda, we got Melissa, we got Eric, we got the coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. We're going to be diving into internal controls, talking about practical insight strategies and definitions on how you can optimize your use of internal controls to drive more compliance, drive a better culture of integrity forward. Couple of quick announcements. So first of all, we have a bunch of new folks on the Ethicsverse, so we got to really welcome them. So I want to see a shower of emojis this entire time so that they can feel welcome on the Ethicsverse. Let's dive right in right now. Socials, podcasts, books. This is what you got to be feeding yourself. Oops, sorry about that. You got to be feeding yourself and sharpening your saw. There's so much great content coming out from thought leaders in our space. So I encourage you to get out there and check out some of these great podcasts. Ethico is going to be putting out a book called the FCPA Survival Guide by Tom Fox. We have a podcast on that coming out. And the Great Women in Compliance podcast just keeps dropping fire every single week. They have a great one this week with Margarita and Mel Sponholz, who just won Compliance Week's Mentor of the Year Award. Definitely check that out. We can all have a much bigger impact when we open up that that mentorship aperture, and Mel is really a phenomenal example of that. These Compliance Week Awards are coming out hot and heavy, so check those out. Albemarle won Compliance Program of the Year. Their story is really, really phenomenal. We're going to try to get that whole team on. As always, we love giving away books. You know, we don't even like money, making money around here. We just like giving away books. We have the one and only Eric Young on. We're giving away Eric's book today. And his book is called Declaration of Independence: How Independent Compliance Officers and Directors Can Hold Management More Accountable. I really love this book. It really captures not only the plight and the struggles that compliance officers have, but it also has so many great frameworks and great tactics that you can employ immediately before you even finish the book. You can employ immediately to drive your impact forward. So we're going to be giving 5 of those away. We're already up to 671 emojis. That's a great start in the first couple of minutes here. We're giving 5 of these away for those who are most active in the chat. Those who I like the best, etc. Drop your LinkedIn in the chat. Your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. You got to connect with people. We have a very collegial industry, and it's one that is something that you should be taking advantage of. I want to read a quick quote here for you from somebody who I think you might like. The quote is, I am obsessed with Ethico. I haven't had a chance to circle back, but he liked the ease of use and the friendliness. This is a great opportunity to educate him on the issues we've encountered with our current vendor, and he can appreciate that ethical system would make life so much easier. So this is in response to one of our famous benchmark reports. People are using these custom benchmark reports to really drive some conversations forward with leadership who doesn't understand the nuance of our space. So if you're interested in that, drop a 1 in the chat and someone will reach out to you to get that going. Ethico's ecosystem helps you engage more stakeholders in your ethics and compliance program, reveal risks, mitigate those risks in an efficient, consistent way, and ultimately demonstrate effectiveness and drive that culture of integrity forward that's going to ultimately promote sustainable business outperformance. So we got a bunch of awards there. If you're interested in that or checking out how you can de-risk your transition with a year free, please reach out to us. And I'm going to keep talking about this. I want to get 100, maybe 200 responses for the Ethicsverse survey. We take very seriously the hour you spend with us every week. We want this to be valuable. We never want this to be a thinly veiled sales presentation, and we're always open for input on how we can make it better. So please share your thoughts, experiences, and advice for us because we want to keep making this better. We got the one and only Matt Kelly. He is coming at us from, he's been in outer space, now he's back in Boston, I think, but he is the CEO and editor of Radical Compliance. If you're not reading that blog every day, you should. He's the coolest guy in compliance, someone I love to do the Ethicsverse with, so I will pass it over to him. How's it going, Matt?
It's going very well, Nick. Thank you very much. And yes, I am not in outer space, contrary to what some people might say when they read my blog. I am just here in Boston. And we have a great panel today. So I will introduce the subject and our speakers. We're going to talk about internal controls and the challenges around how to build a good system of internal controls for compliance. So we have our speakers include, first, Nick, that's you looking very tinfoily and silvery.
Thank you. Spring has sprung, Matt.
Also, Lucia Wind. Lucia is the chair of COSO, which is the group that has published for the better part of 20 years now the internal control framework that most businesses use for control with or compliance with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And Lucia used to be the head of internal audit at Unisys, big government services contractor. Lucia, welcome. Thank you for being aboard here today.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the conversation and the questions that we get.
All right. And also with us is, I think, Melissa Cefello-Boyle from Allianz. You have to dial in, I think. But Melissa, are you out there? Nope. Looks like she was, but she's not. Melissa is one of the compliance people at Allianz who I know works closely on internal controls. So if she does get in, she's having some technical difficulties, she'll join. Also with us, however, is Eric Young, who, Eric, I don't know if we have a bio slide for you. That might have fallen through. But Eric is a senior managing director at Guidepost Solutions and formerly a longtime compliance person in the financial services sector. So Eric, welcome to you too.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Matt. And thanks, Nick, as well. Looking forward to the discussion.
And let's see if we can just get back to our internal controls title slide. But what I had really wanted to talk about here was the challenge that compliance officers have with internal controls. I'll give all of the listeners here a quick example, because this conversation I had just yesterday with the compliance officer at a fairly significant publicly traded company. She is working with her internal audit team to develop a good system of internal controls. And they are frustrated with each other, not because they don't want to work together, but she basically said they are speaking two different languages. That internal audit has been working on financial internal controls for 20 years as part of Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. And it's a bit of a bridge to get from there to the internal controls that compliance people need, where it might be much more about non-financial issues or financial issues that aren't necessarily material, such as a bribery scheme, which can cause big problems, but is not usually going to be a material item for companies. So there's a lot of confusion there about what internal controls are, how they are supposed to work together in a big seamless system, how you, the compliance team, work with other parts of the enterprise to figure out what a good internal control would be. That's the sort of stuff I want to try to cover today. As usual, for all the listeners, if you have questions or comments along the way, just pop them into the group chat and we will try to get to those as quick as we can. I wanted to kick things off by basically asking each of our panelists what you think some of the big misconceptions or misunderstandings or struggles compliance people have with internal controls, whether they're not quite sure what an internal control is or how to design it well or anything else. But I'll start with Lucia first, and then Eric, and then Nick. Like, what do you see as, I guess, maybe the big struggle that compliance people have with internal controls?
So I'll probably have the flip side of the equation, having been head of audit, right, and having spoken, and I've worked with some very fabulous chief compliance officers in my life. But I think that the struggle that sometimes auditors do have when they have that conversation is that the chief compliance officers just think, hey, well, I don't have any internal controls because I don't own financial reporting. So I've seen the flip side of the equation play out as well. Probably contradicts the story that you and the discussion that you had with your friend the other day. But I think, unfortunately, internal controls have become a household name as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley. We have been kind of brought up with the term of, what is an internal control? What is the definition? How does it work? And why do we have them? Because of SOX and because of financial reporting since 2004. So unfortunately, they kind of got this bad rep of being just associated with financial reporting. But we all know on this call, there is so much more to internal controls than that. I look at controls as being something that goes far outside of financial reporting and being a very important key aspect in any process, and compliance being one of those.
And Eric, what do you see as one of the, misperceptions, difficulties, or where do compliance officers kind of struggle with understanding what an internal control is and how it's supposed to work?
So part of it is definitional as to what is an internal control, what is even compliance, and if you throw in operational risk, quote unquote, that's another one where there's a lot of misconception. Part of it is historic because compliance functions, compliance officers often were or continue to be lawyers reporting into the general counsel. So they look at things from a legal regulatory lens versus
right.
Those that live with internal controls, as Lucia mentioned, look at the financial reporting perspective. What I like about COSO is they've looked at risk management on an enterprise-wide basis, which means we can't be in silos anymore. The left hand and the right hand must work together because one gap can create larger gaps elsewhere. And the issue with compliance is it's usually a consequence of weaknesses in financial reporting, like books and records. It could be weaknesses in cyber and technology or the front office in terms of conduct. So compliance needs to be enterprise-wide, just as finance needs to be enterprise-wide. And they have to find that middle ground to work together because there's tech, ops, human resources, and businesses that need compliance and finance to lead the way, if you will. And that starts with compliance and internal controls, which are not mutually exclusive.
And Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Just kidding. I do agree. But I think it's a few things that folks kind of struggle with or that I've seen. One is that I think it's sometimes hard to articulate the value of the controls to the business. And so they can sometimes be perceived as, bureaucratic or burdensome or something like that. So that's one. Sometimes I've seen it kind of be viewed as like a one-time thing. So they kind of get put in place one time versus kind of that ongoing process of like continuous monitoring and improvement of the control itself. So I don't think your internal control apparatus should be like the way you treat your 401k, set it and forget it. So that kind of takes constant work. I've also seen like a bit of a over-reliance on sort of soft controls like training. Those are kind of before the fact, kind of trying to preempt the violation or whatever. I think sometimes a lack of hard controls to kind of complement those soft controls can allow some sort of, bad behavior or bad things to happen like that to persist. And I think maybe the last one is kind of thinking about it less on a practical and efficient basis. And that might be due to like a lack of understanding of the operation and what that control's burden would be on that operation. So those are a few that come to mind for me.
So I also, in fact, wanted to pick up on something you had just mentioned, Nick, about hard and soft controls, and just make sure all the listeners really can appreciate what those are, and are those the only types of internal controls. So I was thinking that there would be hard controls like something coded into the accounting system. No check is going to go out for more than $1 million without these forms of approval, period. Versus a soft control, which is more like we have a good internal hotline and we have annual training about why it's important to speak up. Are those the only types of internal controls out there, or do we have other types? Or, how should people be thinking about what categories of internal controls there even are? Maybe I'll just go in the same order. Lucia, walk me through it, and then Eric, and then Nick.
So I don't think controls fall into those two buckets for sure. When you think about, an organization and what they do, you can have an internal control be part of any process. Just skip finance. Let's just skip finance. We've talked about it ad nauseum, I think, by now, right? Is if you go past that, any process in a company can have and should have internal controls, whether it's manufacturing, it's your sales function, it's your IT function, it's your engineering function, right? There should be internal controls built into those processes. Whether you realize it's an internal control or not, by definition of internal controls under Sarbanes-Oxley or the COSO framework, there are controls all over the place. Some of them are judgmental in nature when you make critical judgments in a decision process. based on development of a product or whatnot, and specifics and configurations. And so controls are all over the place, whether you realize it or not, and they go far beyond financial reporting and the hard and the soft. I don't know what we would want to call them and come up with the categories, but even when you think about the traditional labeling of controls and the attributes of controls outside of, you can apply it to financial, but you can apply it to non-financial, but it's completeness, it's accuracy, it's preventive, it's detective, the frequency of it, that does not have to be for financial reporting. That can be anywhere in any process within an organization where critical decision or step is being made that impacts that process or that transaction.
So the sign on the bathroom that says all employees must wash hands, what kind of control would you call that?
That one would probably go into a soft for me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
But that is kind of a control, right? Or it's intending to be something like that, or does that not rise to the?
No, it's certainly in the food industry.
Yeah.
Right?
At a restaurant, right?
That may be a hard control in the food industry. It may be a soft controls if you work virtually at home, right? And you should, but
you're cooking for your in-laws or something, right?
Right.
The reason I ask is because to a certain extent, I've often wondered, couldn't hard controls or technical controls, to use another form, couldn't that do the job that, the sales guy in the emerging market says, I need a discount for a government customer. And we all know that's a bribe and that's an FCPA violation. But the hard control would be, give us all the documentation that, this discount is legitimate. And if their documentation isn't there, then the discount is not granted. We bill them the full freight. Like, that's a hard control. And I've said before, couldn't that just solve your FCPA problems? Right. And numerous FCPA people have told me no, but it's much more complicated than that. Eric, ask you
Matt,
first, and then Lucia,
Matt,
I'll circle back.
I finally got on via audio only, luckily, but if I could jump in, luckily. I think, a lot of what happens in compliance is gray area, right? And
yes.
Hard controls just don't account for gray area. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I get a call in a week that says, hey, our control didn't really account for this situation. So, we control for 80% of compliance situations, but the other 20% we kind of have to get a feel for. So, that's where hard controls work, but they're just not going to be a cure-all.
All right. That was Melissa Cefello-Boyle. Everybody. Yeah. Eric, go ahead. You take it away.
Sure. I agree with what both Melissa and Lucia are saying, point one. Point two is it's the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. You need both. And so you need both hard controls and hard controls and soft controls. Also, Lucia made some really good points around how there's multiple controls at different parts of the continuum, as I like to say, because on the one hand, controls need to be linear, in which there's handoffs of controls, because in many ways, manufacturing, finance, it's all a process that needs to go from point A to B to C. And you need controls along the way, and you need owners of those controls. And at the same time, it's also three-dimensional, in which, as Nick knows, I like to call it the Rubik's Cube, because you have multiple legal entities, potentially with multiple regions, multiple products. So you need controls, but know where they belong in each of those cubes of that Rubik cube. And every time you think you align it in terms of controls, something else could be misaligned. And where you have bribery and cooking the books and records, so to speak, I call that painting the Rubik's Cube to make it look nice. So the point is, you need to map out the processes because it's linear and understand where there's gaps and overlaps in controls or owners. And also understand the moving dynamic aspect of controls, because it is very three-dimensional with multiple risks externally and internally with legal entities, divisions, personalities, cultures, the board, where are they in terms of controls? So it's trying to understand how that enterprise, a living entity, ultimately works.
And Matt, can I just chime in quickly?
Go ahead.
And just food for thought for the conversation, right, is most controls are designed, when they're being designed, for they're not designed for absolute assurance, right? They're designed for reasonable assurance. So it's very hard to design something that's going to catch 100% of
good point
things 100% of the time over and over again. I mean, systematically, when you have automated controls, it should, right? But even then, it might be an issue. And then based on your configuration, and controls are not designed for collusion. Many of them are not. So when you can have approvals, but when you have numerous people colluding in a process, whether that's financial or non-financial, whatever that may be, that transaction, right? It's really hard to be, hey, you have a hard control, you have a soft control. But it neatly fits into one of the other buckets. There's just so much judgment to apply. Sorry.
No, well, here's a good question from one of the audience members who said, I totally appreciate the idea and application of soft controls, but I'll take a hard or technical control any day of the week. And I guess, I would take that and turn it into a question is more, how do you actually try to enforce the soft controls, for lack of a better word? Like, hard controls, I would say, are sort of self-executing, like either you've done the thing and the control lets it happen or you haven't. But, how do you really kind of put the force behind soft controls to make sure that they work well? Melissa, let me ask you that question first, since you're thinking about this a lot at Allianz, and then I'll take any thoughts from other people about, like, I still struggle with how you get soft controls to work well. What do you say?
Yeah, I think, something we're doing here at Allianz Life is really a great example. We recently launched an initiative focused on the fact that every employee voice matters. So our chief compliance officer launched an initiative that basically gives an employee the key phrase to use when speaking to their managers that says, hey, I'm saying something important, I need you to listen. And when they use that phrase, it kind of signals that this is a key conversation. And I think that's been great to enforce those soft controls here to really push culture. Our hotline, of course, is great here, and we're lucky in that we have a parent company that also monitors that hotline, and a European regulator involved in that as well, because we're owned by a parent company. But I think, maintaining such a strong culture here at Allianz Life has been key to maintaining our soft controls. Bad behavior is really noticed here very quickly, because it's so outside of the norm.
That is a great idea to have like a key phrase or a warning phrase, a stress word, I think that other people would call it. I haven't heard that before. That's a fine addition to a good soft control.
Yeah.
Nick and Eric, let me ask you both, what do you think about how you can kind of put soft controls into practice? Like they're, as people have said, they're kind of a gray area where hard controls are black and white. They're easy to get your head around. This is working, it's not. But Nick, what would you say about how do you get that read on soft controls?
Well, I think what Melissa said is right. I mean, to the extent there's not something stopping a certain behavior from like actually occurring, then there's some room for that behavior to occur. And so the correcting mechanism has to be, the internal controls of the individuals, right? Like their adherence to this standard or this, process or whatever. And I think it is cultural. And if you don't have that feedback loop of, that essentially risk intelligence coming back to some sort of central brain, then those behaviors are going to persist. And that might actually move the, that might move the goalposts of what's, functionally acceptable inside the organization, irrespective of the intent of whatever soft control, is trying to prevent that behavior. So I think it is cultural. And I think that's why, that's why Lucinda's point is kind of critical, that like they all kind of dance together and there's no silver bullet that you're going to correct every single thing, which then kind of comes back to that sort of real safety net, is that culture of integrity and that, those guiding principles for your particular organization. If those are in the hearts and minds of people, then that's going to be a natural correcting mechanism in those gray areas where the absence of, hard controls are going to prevent something from happening.
Eric and Lucia, do you have any thoughts along these lines? Go ahead.
Sure. I would add that hard controls and soft controls need to work together. And I think training is a good example in which it promotes and creates awareness. But then what's the hard control to track, escalate, and discipline those that don't do the training in a serial violative way? I know examples, including myself, where if they were serial violators of training, which is just one example, then we would lock them out of the building and shut them off the systems, and they would quickly get the message. And that's a good hard control. And we would hold the bosses accountable too, because it's their employees that's blowing off the training. In terms of whistleblowing and more broadly monitoring behavior, because that's really what you're asking, is more predominant on the financial services space, but spreading more broadly is surveilling behavior through monitoring communications. And that's why there's increasingly more enforcement actions around off-channel communication.
Right.
It's not just about retention, but it's also about what's being communicated evasively. And that could be bribery, that could be sanctions, it could be many things. And then whistleblowing retaliation, it's easy to track how many complaints there are, but not enough means to monitor retaliation, which is a very real issue, illegal, and a need to monitor that behavior effectively to escalate and then again discipline.
Lucia, let me ask you a question as chair of COSO. I am wondering that really the COSO framework started to be widely used 20 years ago after passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And I have heard people say that it was overweighted to financial reporting. And we've sort of, grown up with that reality that it is a good, strong framework for financial reporting, but people don't quite know how to use it for non-financial, when over the last 20 years, the biggest risks are cybersecurity, privacy, they are anti-corruption, probably going to be supply chain and ESG in the next 10 years or so. So, there's a bit of a disconnect between internal auditors who have used COSO and thought about it in terms of financial reporting. And like my person from yesterday had said, they don't quite know how to get auditors to speak the current language of data privacy, regulatory compliance, everything else. And like there's a mismatch that COSO, the framework was overweighted in one place and underweighted in another. Is that fair to say, or how have we tried to correct the imbalance?
So I think there's a misconception about COSO, and I'll just maybe spend 30-second elevator speech to fix that. So the original framework was weighted to internal controls over financial reporting in 1992, and that is what was adopted for COSO or recommended for COSO. Not necessarily, it's not a requirement, but last I heard was 95% of the listed companies in the U.S. State that they're utilizing the COSO framework. Not sure what the other 5 do, but I'm sure it's something that they agree to with their external auditors on and are comfortable with and using. In 2013, COSO actually did see this issue come up and start seeing the trend. And in 2013, the revision to the COSO framework was actually for it to be an integrated framework. So the framework is now called ICIF, Integrated Framework, and the intent behind it was that it really can be used for any process out there, not just financial reporting. I think a lot of auditors in internal audit and external audit are just kind of stuck in that rut because they use it for financial reporting. But when you actually go read the 2013 ICIF, the examples and the points of focus that are listed in the 17 principles are neutral to a process and can be applied to anything. We have recently issued guidance in spring of last year around sustainability reporting. So we took that ICF and said, here's how you can use it for sustainability reporting. And we provided examples. Cool. Here's how you can use it for fraud risk management, not just financial fraud risk management, right? You can have fraud in other areas than just financial reporting. You can certainly take it and use it for cybersecurity. There's other more well-known frameworks out there in the IT space and cyberspace, but you truly can. And if you look at the principles, they don't talk about financial reporting. When you look at, like when you actually read the 17 principles, none of them actually say financial reporting. So.
I guess, Melissa, I was going to ask you.
I just want to jump in here for a second, Matt.
Sure, go ahead.
As a former auditor, I've been in my compliance role about a year now, but I spent 10 years of my career as an auditor, right? So to defend the auditors here, having been in some progressive audit organizations, I will say, I have seen operational and compliance controls looked at in audit time and time again. And one of the things that I think is important is, you know, in the early days of my audit career, I heard a lot of, you know, things will get caught in review. We won't worry about that. And, you know, rework wasn't seen as a risk. I think now, later in my career, I'm not seeing that issue. You know, I really am seeing audit organizations looking at this more broadly. I'm seeing, you know, people taking continuing education that looks at this as a more broad scope. And I think, you know, COSO, as well as the new IIA standards that have just come out, are really bringing our audit partners into the conversation with compliance, risk, and operations to have these conversations more broadly.
Good. That's great to hear.
I guess, you know, that would probably lead into another point that I wanted to explore on the webinar is how do we work to design an effective internal control and who talks to whom? I'm sure that compliance would be one part of that conversation. Internal audit might be another, but you know, there's going to be certain operational parts of the business that have to be involved. And how do those conversations happen? You know, you get everybody in the room to say, here's our risk, and therefore we need to have a control that fits, and we want it to be this much hard, this much soft, or vice versa, something like that. Like Eric and Nick, let me ask you both, you know, how would you approach this, trying to figure out the right way to design an internal control? Eric, I'll start with you and then Nick.
Sure. So I'm a big process map fan. Because then you understand, and everyone understands how to get from point A to point B to C, whether it be for disclosure purposes or safety, whatever the case may be, because then you can understand where the controls need to be, and more importantly, who the owners should be. And the point is, another way of looking at internal controls is it is about people, process, and technology that need to work together. Most important are the people who own the controls. So once roles and responsibilities and accountabilities are clear based on those processes and mapping of controls, then it becomes clearer as to who's accountable. And no one wants to be accountable when something goes wrong. But those initial steps are probably the most crucial. And sadly, many firms don't want to spend the time or the money to go through that exercise.
Right. Which is so crazy, right? I just dropped into the chat one of my favorite articles of all time from HBR, and it's called Fair Process. And it's all about how to manage better in the knowledge work economy, where we are our work. It's less of a command and control. There's a lot more sort of creativity that goes into it. And there's a lot more voluntary buy-in that's necessary for any initiative to actually be successful. So how do we hack that from the human beings whose, you know, compliance is necessary for whatever initiative we're talking about? And it comes down to, I think, ultimately like representation or involvement. So to your point, Eric, pulling a little bit of that work forward, you know, before you launched the control and bringing, you know, our country was started from taxation without representation. So to the extent that an internal control feels like taxation and they have no representation into how that control is like constructed or what the most efficient way to solve it, well, then the odds of compliance are just going to be a little bit lower. So you might get some insights from them. You might get their buy-in from a deeper level. I can just tell you, when we push change across our small organization, nowhere near the size of, you know, the organizations you've worked in and so forth, when there's pushback at the individual contributor level, and then they hear that their boss or somebody in their department participated in the thing, it's like there's such a drop in anxiety. There's such an increase in like the ultimate buy-in. And I think to the extent we can't map every single possible decision and put quote unquote hard or proactive controls in place, then we need that sort of authentic buy-in, back to that spirit of the law comment you made earlier, Eric. And I don't know how you get that without like compulsion. You know what I'm saying? It's either like persuasion or compulsion. You know what I mean?
Melissa,
Exactly.
Can I get you to chime in on that too? Because I think Nick raised some excellent points about defining who is accountable and making sure they understand where that answer came from. But like, how do you think that through at Allianz about designing a good internal control that makes clear who's accountable for what, and it still reflects the reality of how people do their jobs? Like, how does that work, Melissa?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think a couple things are important here. One, we very strongly follow a 3 lines of defense model here at Allianz. So operations, the first line really has to own their controls when it comes to, you know, compliance with regulations that operations deals with on a day-to-day basis. Second, you know, we look at when we're designing a compliance control and we're sitting down and consulting with them, we talk about what's already in place. You know, what processes, what procedures, what systems are already there, so that we can make controls that aren't overly burdensome for our business partners. But at the end of the day, you know, they have to own it. And they know that. We have that conversation regularly. We talk about that regularly. You know, we work with our risk partners, our audit partners to make sure that those controls aren't over-tested by every single team. So we coordinate our testing and decide who's going to test what every year. You know, there's luckily an initiative from our parent company to really outline and structure all of this work. And that's been huge for us. So, you know, we're really lucky to have the Allianz Group working with us on this. But I think, you know, having open conversations and talking about what works is the important part.
Lucia, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think it was all very well covered. I mean, I do love to hear that Melissa is using the 3 lines model. That's always great to hear. You know, auditors cannot be part of every single conversation that is happening in a company about internal. I mean, think about the internal audit team has how many people, right? Depending on your staffing, like they just cannot cover the ground to be in every single meeting when controls are being designed, still do their testing, work with their external auditors to complete their testing and whatnot. There's just a lot of ground to be covered. So, but hopefully they're part of the key conversations that are happening, right? Where the advice is truly needed, that management, you know, wants to seek their input, whether it's chief compliance officers or any second line of defense or even the first line of defense.
I suppose one thing that sticks in my mind, this is an example from the headlines, this happened just last week, was that British regulators fined a very large bank in the US for a so-called fat finger error, where the trader at the bank put the wrong number in the wrong field on the computer system. Instead of selling $58 million, which is what he wanted to do, he put in a sell order for 400 billion with a B of trades that he wanted to execute. And the system actually threw up a warning on his screen. Are you sure you want to do that? Because here are the red flags. And it had 711 individual red flags. So that would have been a list this long on your screen. But the control,
reasonableness control.
The control had the OK button right up at the top. So it's like, yeah, sure, whatever, click.
And he had those fat sausage fingers. So, you know what I'm saying?
But something as simple as making him scroll through all 711 and click OK at the bottom, maybe he would have said, okay, that's weird. Whoa, wait. And then he would have realized the mistake. Right. But these simple, subtle things where they created a control that was really there for compliance, that you have clicked OK, not to slow you down and make you think about, is this a risk? And I wonder about that a lot, that how do teams work together to focus on the risk more than to go through the compliance exercise that everybody did everything according to procedure, just, you know, oops, it messed up anyways. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that. Eric, you came from banking. Like, what do you think of these sorts of issues? You know, we design controls to show we did something, not to address a risk. How often does that happen?
Sure. Well, it's like one expression is, we've all seen that movie before, and the scary part is, you know, we won't mention names, but we all have 10 fingers. That's the scary part. And then we have, you know, tens of thousands of employees. So if you multiply that potential likelihood of happening, in this case, fat fingers, without the proper controls, then the question is, has the company or has the industry learned, especially if it keeps happening over and over? Because if you go back 10, 20 years, the same issue probably arose perhaps in other institutions with the same underlying problem. So then the question goes back to hard controls and soft controls and how well they work together, because it was the mindset, oh, you know, I'll blow off that flag saying, are you sure you want to do this? But the system should also flag that the control was overridden. and what was done about it, and what was the consequence to make sure that it doesn't keep happening over and over, because otherwise it will keep happening over and over. So unfortunately, even with the best of systems, people can still somehow override the systems. And the question then is the consequence and the metrics to measure, one, the flags, two, the escalation, and three, the decisions to have a consequence. It's all connected, but not executed enough.
That's where I would say that documentation as a control is so important, that if you want to override the control, sure, but document that so the override decision sticks out like a sore thumb, right, and you have the accountability if that override decision turns out to be foolish in hindsight. Yes. I was also curious, and maybe, Lucia, this is a question for you. How much is modern technology changing the landscape for internal controls? Because I had another friend who said, really, everything is going to be automated, and the control is either, you know, basically you're just reviewing the performance of some other control, but you know, management review is what's really happening here. The controls just run on autopilot while you make sure that the running is fine. Is that, how would you respond to that? And what is the bigger challenges that come with modern IT anyways?
Yeah, so I do want to go back to your previous question, because while you guys were all talking, I was staring at my keyboard trying to figure out how you get 58
Same.
into 4. I'm like, the numbers are not even next to each other on my keyboard. So,
unless it's maybe the 9 key, I don't know. I mean, how do you get that? I mean, that's crazy.
Not even the 9 key. I literally am looking at my 9 key, and it just does not work out. But that aside, you know, technology is growing, and it's growing exponentially. I mean, we all had to embrace technology so much more during COVID. I mean, so many more companies that never really were even intending to automate some of their processes had to, right? Because we were not sitting next to each other in a hallway to walk over whatever you had to walk over for a signature. So I feel like technology grew faster and more rapidly than it probably was going to if there wouldn't have been COVID, because we had to adopt. It has some beautiful things that come with it, right? You can now audit 100% of your population and focus on anomalies, because you can write scripts when it comes to internal controls and just truly focus on the exception to the rule, so you can better utilize your resources, whether that's your auditors or it's your actual, you know, process owners who actually do these transactions and have supervisory reviews of just, hey, just kick back to me the contract that does not fit this criteria. That's not a, you know, standard contract or whatever it is, to build into your workflow. So it's got some great automation and efficiencies. However, what is obviously becoming so much more important is the understanding and the technical capabilities of IT auditors and IT controls. So that is a skill set where I've talked about this with Richard Chambers fairly recently. I do feel like it's going to require upskilling of talent, where you at some point hopefully will not have business process auditors and IT auditors, or compliance officers that just think business process versus IT controls that they have built into their tools for compliance, whether it's bribery, anti-bribery approvals, or, you know, any kind of, you know, controls that you have built into it. But everybody will have to think about both, because technology is here to stay. Very few processes are now purely manual. And I'll throw in the buzzword that everybody's talking about, obviously, is AI, right? I almost put that into a whole separate bucket from regular data controls and automated processes, because AI modules can be trained. And if they're not trained with the appropriate set of controls and biases or lack of biases, you could get very wrong controls coming out of the process if AI is what you want to rely on to execute your controls and kick out examples. And that's a whole new thing to unpack, is have you trained your AI model with all the transactions you would typically see in your course of business, or all ethnicities, or all, you know, employee levels, or whatever is that, you know, all financial transactions, whatever that model is, if it's numerical or non-numerical, so then the AI can execute properly. And I feel like that is a different category than just your general IT controls.
Here's a good question from a listener who is basically saying that if the controls are going to run, and then the human's job is just to review the exceptions that get generated, this assumes that the humans will review those reports in a timely manner, or even eventually maybe the AI is going to start reviewing these. And so there are some concerns about how these management review controls, how efficiently or how diligently are we managers going to do them? Melissa, let me ask you what you think about those kind of questions. And then Nick and Eric, too, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, so I think this comes down to a key question about how we design controls, right? One of the things that we talk about in audit is if you didn't document it, it didn't occur. And I think, you can document that you did a review, but one of the questions that we often ask is, what did you review? We go in and we do a walkthrough and we say, when you're looking at this, what are you actually reviewing? And if a manager can't tell us what they're regularly looking at, then we know it's a rubber stamp review, right? So knowing how the control is designed, maybe documenting what they're actually looking at, I think is key. I think making sure that your managers are well trained on what to look at and changing what they're looking at on a regular basis, rotating who's reviewing the report so that they're not getting complacent is going to help in those scenarios. I think the other thing that we're not talking about with AI is the ability to adjust our controls depending on a change in our risk level. So throughout a year here, our risk level changes drastically depending on threats we may be seeing from a cybersecurity perspective or the way that our transactions are changing. And I think we have an ability coming up to be able to see those changes in risk level and rapidly change our controls depending on that risk. And I'm really excited about that. I think, it'll allow us to better manage risk. And I think it's a really cool, exciting opportunity. Obviously we're not there quite yet, but I'm really excited to see where we go with that as well.
Nick and then Eric, I still want to get your thoughts too on this idea that if we're depending more on management reviews as a control, then we need to depend more on the managers having their heads in the game and understanding what to do, and they're doing it. Tell me more about how you think, what some of the challenges are there, or how to make sure that kind of overview and oversight actually happens and happens well.
Sounds like we might need a review of the reviewers. We might need some more controls on that, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like whenever there's like decision making, whenever there's gray involved, you're going to be relying on something to get that right answer. It's either going to be some kind of algorithmic, kind of tech-based control or whatever, or it's going to be the application of someone's brain power and competency to judge that. I think we do run the risk of just kind of shifting the problem, right? Like shifting the problem and saying like, okay, well, I'm going to rely on all these, for lack of a better term, I know some of us hate this term, bunch of hard controls, and then I'm just, manager's just going to review those exceptions. To your point, those exceptions need to be reviewed in an authentic way, and the chance, at least for rubber stamping, with that human, that management human being, is at least there. It's not zero. So, I mean, how is that not just shifting the problem? And I think there is an externality, perhaps a negative externality, that comes from a preponderance of hard controls in an operation that kind of lets people outsource their own thinking. Like at some level, look, we're not in a full AI economy yet. So at some level, we're still relying on that thinking. And if that critical thinking is not in place and people are ostensibly, individual contributors, whatever, people on the front line, if they're ostensibly just relying on the track that the hard controls create for their train to run on, well, then there can be derailments like this or a lot of other, there's myriad examples of things like this where a control, did stop that person and yet they overrode it despite that. So, again, it's just there's no silver bullet with controls. I think it's always going to be to Melissa's point, it's always going to be a dynamic process of refining it, seeing gaps in the control apparatus, and changing that for new risks that are coming up and so forth.
Eric, what do you think about making sure that the managers in these management review controls, how do you get them fully engaged and aware?
So it's a good example of the interaction between technology and humans. So in other words, the technology, as Lucia said, will provide deeper and wider monitoring or surveillance to flag exceptions, which is another way of saying it's a model or algorithm that takes in data and analyzes it with some output. And the bank regulators basically say that's a model which has rules that need to be recalibrated every year, because otherwise alerts will keep backlogging and no one follows the humans just don't have time, or they're lazy, or somewhere in between. Because ultimately the control, going back to a continuum, is what action or consequences taken because of all these alerts. And the metaphor I always use is the Ring camera, where you can adjust the sensitivity of the camera, which is a type of technology. So you can capture all the alert, raccoons and squirrels that pass by and do nothing about it. But if you adjust the sensitivity so that you miss the burglars as well and do nothing about it, or see the burglars and do nothing about it, then what's the point? So the point is, it's how the technology and the humans interact and what the consequence of the alert in terms of investigation and action results, which, by the way, also needs to be documented. So those controls not only need to be in place, but also recalibrated regularly.
I did want to get to one or two of the audience questions. And Lucia, here's one that probably is right up your alley. Kind of riffing off of what Melissa had said about artificial intelligence, somebody's just asking, how can AI change the whole scenario of internal control? And how do you think AI might either complicate what you're trying to control, or how you could use it, the way Melissa was saying that, you know, you might be able to use it to make your controls more responsive to changing risks? What have you thought about this so far?
So I agree. I think there's a huge potential to be unwrapped and untapped when it comes to AI, right? Again, if trained properly and developed properly, I go back into the configuration, because that's where you're going to make it or break it, right? So putting in that effort up front, not taking any shortcuts, really understanding what it can and cannot do for you and how it can evolve and how it will likely evolve, right? It's AI, will be critical. So I think there's a huge potential for that for the future. We just really need to be careful. I think we still are learning more about this. I think it will be easier in non-financial transactions. I am just more hesitant in anything that's financial or critical decision making to deploy AI, because that's going to be a tough nut to crack, especially with the external auditors, to get comfortable. I feel like you'll be chasing things for quite some time before you come to an agreement, but maybe I'm wrong. I look forward to what AI can do for us, for auditors, for professionals, for, you know, process owners, or across the three lines of defense, you know, across all of them, because there is such huge potential, and really truly just deploying your human non-AI resources for the skills that AI cannot do, right? And that's always been the intended thing, is let's move the routine transactional things, right, to be more automated, whether it's AI or it's the RPA or whatever you want to use, whatever term, right? And truly use the human potential to be tapped into the critical thinking skills, and where you truly need a human to assess not just scenario and A and B with that transactions, but anything else that can happen around it, right? And human right now is probably the best suited for that. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe AI is already there and I just haven't seen it.
I agree. The human judgment is still critical ultimately, and it goes back to culture. You need both.
Exactly. Here is another question. How can we be sure that when we find deficiencies in internal control, they actually get addressed? And I have seen multiple big banks faulted on that before. They know they've got internal control weaknesses and they still can't seem to get them resolved. Let me ask Melissa first, because Allianz is not a small company. How do you assure that, you know, things are moving forward? And then maybe Eric and Nick too.
Yeah, so I want to start with our internal audit function has an incredible tracking and KPI mechanism that assigns an owner to every audit and risk deficiency. So every internal control deficiency is assigned an owner. It's set with a due date, and that due date is very highly monitored. Any, you know, overdue deficiencies are reported up to the executive level, and the people who are responsible for them have to answer to their executive as to why that's overdue, especially for, you know, things that are high risk. We also go in and validate that those issues are actually resolved when they're reported to be resolved. So I think that's been a great process. You know, for things that are non-audit issues, we have a pretty similar process, right? Those due dates are tracked. We look into, are they actually resolved when they're reported to be resolved? And that's a pretty controlled process. And I think, making executives and VPs responsible for the issues in their areas and driving that accountability is really important.
And Eric, what would you say?
I like to say that some industries are really good at doing really bad things, and that's why they're so highly regulated. And it's not just the financials, it's also the non-financials, at least where safety is critical, whether it be pharma or the medical in terms of privacy, et cetera. And there's a lot of other highly regulated industries. But you can have, thousands and thousands of rules and regulations, but if people still don't follow them, aren't held accountable for them, then it doesn't matter whether there's re-regulation or deregulation. It still boils down to accountability and consequence.
Yeah, and Eric, in fairness to the whole audience, you have told me before that one of your favorite metrics is incomplete internal audit findings that have not been resolved yet, and that is always a good warning sign for corporate culture. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, but I always thought that was fascinating that if management is not leaning on audit findings to get resolved, then nobody's going to care. Why should I care too? Suddenly your corporate culture is going to pot. You want to take 30 seconds to talk about why that metric's so useful?
Yeah, absolutely. So regardless of industry, they often focus first DOJ, then the agencies in terms of external findings, but they forget that the internal audit findings are equally, if not more important. And sadly, many managers and employees ignore the audit findings, which just like alerts, they just add up and they age and they don't get resolved, which means the controls aren't being addressed. So once we created more accountability in terms of backlogged or overdue findings and connected it to their bonus, suddenly a lot of audit findings were being closed and, more importantly, closed properly.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about how to express the urgency of effective internal controls and get them done, or if you just want to give us one or two last words here, because I know we're pretty much up against the hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation was great. Until I think, I'll just kind of summarize my thoughts on it. I just think until, or as long as human beings' decision making is part of your value creation mechanism in your organization, you have to have some accounting for that gray area. And ultimately, I think it's going to come down to, as Eric said, that culture and buy-in. To ensure that, and coupled with Melissa's point of constantly refreshing and constantly looking at new risks and changing those controls appropriately. So there's no silver bullet in this game because everything keeps changing, But I think that mentality of continuous improvement, that mentality of, quality business processes can really help unite and, bring people into your fold to get that buy-in at the middle manager level, so to speak. But yeah, I love this conversation. I'd love one more big round of applause for everybody, for Eric, for Lucia, for Melissa, of course, for Matt. Lucia, I think I may have called you Lucinda, in which case you can block and report me on LinkedIn if you want. But I hope you take my sincere apology. Hope everybody can join us next week. We got a real treat for you. I say that every week, but it's every week there's a treat. Okay, so next week we are talking about, listen to this, risk assessments, practical wisdom to mitigate critical risks with the one and only Sarah Couture. You will not want to miss it. She has a really unique perspective on risk assessments, so I hope you guys can all join us. And yeah, we'll see you guys next week. Thank you all for coming. See ya.
Thank you all.